Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to be talking about post-processing, and in a recent video Emily talked about harvesting and all of the important tips and tricks around making sure that you're picking your vegetables and fruit at the right time or their peak freshness. But the next step of post-harvest is equally important, and it's one that a lot of people overlook. We overlooked it and kind of learned about the importance of post-harvest the hard way. I remember when we were first getting gardens established and we were learning about gardening and starting to grow our own food. And one of the things that I vividly remember was one evening going out in our gardens, and we had a bunch of radish and lettuce that were really nice. They were peak ripeness and just ready to harvest, and I was really excited because it was our first harvest of the season. And so it was in the evening, and I went out and I pulled up the radish and I pulled up the lettuce, and I kind of dusted the dirt off of them and took them inside and just tossed them in the fridge and thought, oh, that's going to make a great dinner here in about 2 hours. And then 2 hours went by, and I went, and already all of that great produce that I had just pulled out of the garden was shriveling up, and the lettuce was wilty and soft, and the radishes were just shriveled up, and all of it was basically garbage because I didn't do anything in the post-harvest process to maintain the freshness of the produce. And so there's a few key principles to keep in mind with post-harvest. First of all is remembering that the plants you're harvesting are still alive. So when you're harvesting vegetables or fruits, you're harvesting living plants. And so the processes within the cells of the plants are still living. Respiration is still happening within the cells. And what we want to do in post-harvest is stop that respiration as quickly as we can, because if that respiration continues, that's what's going to cause wilting, that's what's going to cause plants to shrivel up, and that's what's going to cause a loss of flavor and plants developing bitterness and a loss of texture. So first step is to implement practices that slow respiration. The plants are going to still be alive, the cells within the plants are still going to be alive, but we want to slow their respiration, slow their activity, so that the crop is maintaining its crispness and its freshness. And then the next steps are really cleanliness related. And so how are we cleaning our produce in order to keep it looking nice and to remove any contaminants or anything that's causing the plants that we don't want to get bits of dirt or soil mixed in with our meal at all. And so I'm going to go through, really there's three different types of crops that I keep in mind and the post-harvest for them. And we're going to go through two of them here, and then I'll talk briefly about the third one. So those three different types of crops that we deal with around post-harvest. One is our root crops and our salad greens, or what I really consider the true vegetables. So these are the plants that are really the most susceptible to wilting, and they're the ones that we want to slow that cell respiration immediately and get the plants into a cool environment so that they maintain their crispness and their freshness. So lettuces, root crops, spinach, any of your leafy greens, as well as your cruciferous plants, so broccoli, cauliflower, things like that. The main goal with those is to harvest them, get them into a cool space as soon as possible, and then to do a cold water rinse. And so what I want to show you here is a cold water rinse of the root crops and turnips that Emily harvested, as well as a way to be able to do a cold water rinse of spinach. And so the key thing with what we're trying to do here is we're trying to do a cold water rinse to cool the plant down very rapidly, and then we want the plant to dry off, because if we leave it wet and then we just take a wet crop and we put it directly into the refrigerator and we leave it there, that's when we're going to the plant will start to rot, because the water will act and cause it to start decomposing, and you end up with mold development and things of that nature. And so we want to rapidly cool them and rinse them, and then get them dried off before we put them into cold storage. So with our turnips, we are obviously in a wash station here. This is all things that you can do in your kitchen if you're just gardening at home, or it's also, though, a good reminder of why sometimes having a designated wash station is a really nice thing. So whether that's a space in your house, outside of your kitchen, or if you look on Pinterest or any social media and you search for ideas, you'll find a lot of really cool things that people have done, putting wash stations outdoors in their garden, which is, again, helps you to rapidly get your crops out of the ground into a shaded environment, and then where you can get them chilled as quickly as possible and rinsed as quickly as possible. In our setting, what we have is cold water available, and then for rinsing the root crops, there's nothing real scientific to it. We are simply trying to spray off any of the dirt that came up with the plant. And again, the important part is really cold water so that it's cooling the plant and slowing that cell respiration that's happening. Again, these are living plants. They're still, the processes of life are still happening within the cells of the plants right now. An important note with root crops is if you're not going to be using the crop right away in a meal, the best way to prolong storage life is to actually remove the greens from the root. And so the root is generally what we want, although many of these root crops, the greens are excellent as well, and it's fun to find different ways to use the greens in recipes. But the root is what we're going for most often. And so if we just take this, even though we've done a cold rinse, and we put it in the refrigerator, if we leave it in the refrigerator like this for, let's say, 48 hours, 72 hours, pretty rapidly what's going to start happening is the leaves are going to start pulling moisture, any moisture that's remaining, from the root in order to continue cell respiration within the leaves, which is the living part of the plant. And so we can stop that and maintain the crispness of the root itself by simply cutting the greens off. And so with a knife or kitchen scissors or anything of that nature, you can simply cut the greens off and then store your root crops and your root greens separately. So maybe you still want to keep the turnip greens and use them in a meal, but you know that you're 3 or 4 days off from that. We'll store these in a bag separate from the roots so that they both retain their freshness and you don't have the leaves pulling moisture out of the root, causing it to shrivel and become more bitter. The other crop that we have kind of similar principles to are our greens, where we want to get them inside and we want to get them a cold rinse as soon as possible, and then get them dried as quickly as possible. So with our spinach, I'm going to show you the one tool that we might recommend you purchasing if you don't already have one available for post-harvest work is a green spinner or a salad spinner. We have a large one here behind me that we use for our bigger harvest. It's a 5-gallon capacity, and then it's a hand crank in order to be able to spin the greens. But if you're just home garden scale, something as simple as this, which is something easy to find at almost any kitchen store, or even at Ace Hardware often has things like this, and even grocery stores sometimes have them, is just a salad spinner, small capacity, but works just fine. And here's a little pro trick for when you're rinsing your greens and using your spinner. A good way to be able to do it, we often take our greens and put them into a large sink when we're doing a really large harvest. But if you're just harvesting enough for yourself, you can probably take the greens that you've harvested and put them into the bowl of your salad spinner, and then fill that bowl with cold water. And again, cold water is really important, and it's important to have clean water if you're dealing especially with greens. Greens are one of the highest risk crops, I suppose you could say, for having pathogens on them and carrying diseases like listeria and E. coli and things of that nature. So making sure that you have very clean water. So if you do an outdoor wash station or something of that nature, make sure that you're using potable, clean water for that purpose. But once you have filled the bowl with water, agitating or just moving the greens around to make sure that they're getting fully soaked, and you don't have them layering together where there's might be some that aren't getting contact with the water. Again, this is cooling the crop, which is going to maintain its crispness and its flavor, and it's also washing the crop. And then again, this is the nice kind of tip with these salad spinners. What you can then do is simply pick up your bowl and over a sink or over just a space of where you don't mind getting water, dump the greens out of the bowl into the colander or the spinner, and now very quickly what we want to do is get those greens dry, again to prevent any mildew or anything like that developing. And so that's what this spinner does for us. The spinner is not cleaning the greens, it's simply drying them. So we wash them by having them submerged in the water and agitating the water. and then we dried them in the spinner, and then we can store them in a bag. And the trick with greens is to store them in a bag with some air in it. And so whether you're putting them in a Ziploc or if you're putting them in a container like a plastic or glass food storage container, don't stuff it so full that there's not space for air. If you leave a good pocket of air, it's going to help protect the crop and prevent them from being smashed together, and that will retain the freshness and the crispness of the leaves. So that is the true vegetables. You're going to do the same thing with your cruciferous plants. You have the same objective: get them out of the field into a cool environment, cold rinse right away, and then stored in a way where they're not going to get damaged or beat up. The next category of crops, I mentioned there were three. One is your true vegetables. The other is what I call fruiting vegetables, or really they're fruiting crops. These are things like your legumes, but also your tomatoes, cucumbers, squashes, eggplant, peppers, things of this nature. We don't really have a lot that we do post-harvest with those. The most important part is to get them out of the field and into a cooler environment, but not into a refrigerated environment. If we refrigerate some of those crops, like tomatoes, they actually start to really lose flavor and lose their crispness being in that cold of an environment. So oftentimes we're just trying to harvest those. Things like our peas, for instance, we're simply trying to harvest them and get them into a container where they can be stored and not bruised or beat up, and then stored in a room temperature or maybe slightly cooler than room temperature environment. And the third category of crops are crops that we are going to harvest, and the post-harvest then involves curing. So that's crops like onions, garlic, your winter squashes, pumpkins, butternut squash, things of that nature. That is a process kind of all on its own. The key elements to curing those crops is that you want to harvest them, get them out of direct sunlight and into an environment that's not overly hot. We want it to be cool but not refrigerated. And then the most important thing of all is having really adequate air movement. And so whether that's putting it into a shaded area in your garden where a lot of a breeze is able to blow through, and hanging garlic, oftentimes that's the best way to cure garlic, is to hang it. Or if it's taking it into a cellar type environment where hopefully you have fans or something that's able to keep air movement, that may work well for things like your pumpkins and your winter squashes. The key point with that is those are crops that we consider storage crops that you're going to be keeping for perhaps several months or at least a few weeks, and the curing is what's going to basically seal it so that the plant doesn't rot. And if it's not adequately cured and you simply take garlic, for instance, and you put it directly into a cupboard without good air movement, you're going to end up with it rotting and molding pretty quickly. So again, post-harvest, it's critically important. Three different ways or types of crops that we need to consider it for: your true vegetables, fruiting vegetables, and then crops that you're curing. And the key elements being getting them out of the field into a chilled environment, and then making sure that you're getting a cold rinse done on the crops that require a cold rinse, or that you're storing them in a way where they're not going to get damaged and beat up. So hopefully this helps, and we look forward to sharing more tips in the next videos.